Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. This month, I'm detailing crimes against political figures. In this episode, a disgruntled man whose life is unraveling due to his own actions places the blame on the policies of one political party. His random act of violence will turn a pleasant day at a ballpark into 10 minutes of horror and chaos. This is Chapter 2 of the series, The Politics of Murder, Panic at the Ballpark, the congressional baseball game shooting. The stocky man with the gray goatee had become a fixture at the Alexandria, Virginia YMCA Health Club in the spring of 2017. Most days he arrived at 5:30 a.m. and worked out in the gym before settling into the lobby with other regulars. At first, he mostly kept to himself, sitting in front of his laptop. But after a couple of weeks, he became friendly with other members. He said his name was Tom, and he had only been in Alexandria for a short time. Alexandria, a historic town located along the Potomac River, was just south of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Tom, who said he was looking for work, seemed like a pleasant middle-aged man. He made small talk, but didn't get into many personal details. Occasionally, he'd arrive with a box of donuts or coffee, which he offered to YMCA employees and regulars. Others recalled that Tom was an avid political junkie. He often spent time on the treadmill watching the television screens hanging from the gym's walls. He'd flip back and forth between morning programming on 2 television channels dedicated to political news. The Fox News channel, which skews to the right in favor of the Republican Party and conservative causes, and the MSNBC network, which leans more to the left in its coverage, favoring the Democratic Party and liberal policies and causes. Since arriving in the Washington, D.C. metro area, Tom's activities also suggested this interest in politics. He spent a lot of time in the nation's capital, seeing the sights and visiting government buildings open to visitors. He took lots of photos at some prominent buildings. However, not those typically snapped by tourists. His collection included photos of the east front entrance of the U.S. Capitol building, just inside the visitor entrance to the Dirksen Senate Office building, the front entry of the Library of Congress, and the west side of the Supreme Court building. His sightseeing interests were peculiar. This was because he wasn't in D.C. as a tourist. This visitor was focused on settling a score and was looking for an opportunity to do so. The YMCA was directly across the street from a public park with tennis and basketball courts, a soccer field, and a ball field. Early one morning, he noticed increased activity at the ball field, including what looked like official government vehicles in the parking lot. He inquired about what was happening in the park. He was told that practice was being held for the upcoming congressional charity baseball game. Are they Republicans or Democrats? Tom wanted to know. I think both, came the answer. Tom now saw his plan starting to take shape. He was in the nation's capital to settle a score. In Tom's opinion, the government was evil and corrupt and had ruined his life. It was time for the politicians who represented it to pay. James Thomas Hodgkinson was born in 1951 to James T. and Dolores Hodgkinson. They raised Tom and 2 other children in Belleville, Illinois. Tom Hodgkinson attended Belleville West High School, graduating in 1968. His friends described him as someone who never backed down from his convictions, but also recalled him as a fun-loving guy. He attended college for a few semesters, but didn't complete a degree. In 1976, he started a construction business called JTH Construction. In 1984, Hodgkinson married his wife Sue. Unable to have biological children, they decided to become foster parents. They would house 35 foster children between 1990 and 2003, adopting 2 of their foster daughters. Between 1994 and 1997, Hodgkinson became a licensed real estate agent. He expanded his business, to include his construction knowledge by providing home inspections and air quality testing services to homeowners. However, he worked unlicensed, not obtaining the required home inspector's license until 2003. In 1996, tragedy befell the Hodgkinsons when one of their foster daughters, Wanda Stock, died by suicide. Wanda, just 17 at the time of her death, had only been with the Hodgkinsons for a couple of months when she discovered she was pregnant. After breaking the news to her boyfriend, he dumped her. Devastated, Wanda drove to a rural area outside of town, doused herself with gasoline, and set herself on fire. Of course, this took a toll on both Tom and Sue. Tom, already battling health issues, began to lash out angrily at his family and neighbors. For years, he displayed a short temper, a tendency to drink too much, and an unwillingness to obey authority figures. Now his anger escalated, and he had more frequent outbursts. He began flying into rages, throwing objects at his wife, and yelling at the television screen. Hodgkinson had a police record that went back to 1978. Most were misdemeanors related to traffic violations, with the most serious charge occurring in 1982. After another traffic stop, Hodgkinson was charged with fleeing or eluding a police officer and criminal damage to property. However, the charges were dismissed the following year. On New Year's Eve 1992, he once again attempted to outrun the police after being pulled over. Hodgkinson was charged with 3 moving violations, resisting or obstructing a police officer, and driving under the influence. Once again, most of the charges were dropped. He was only required to pay a fine and perform community service. However, his flouting of laws and noncompliance with authorities continued unabated. He neglected to get the required licenses for the businesses he ran. He seemed to think he did not have to comply with government regulations, even while benefiting from government programs. As licensed foster parents, Hodgkinson and his wife received government subsidies to aid them in providing for the children for whom they became caregivers. Hodgkinson also worked as a housing rehabilitation and weatherization contractor for the county, receiving over $140,000 in contracts from the federally funded program. In 2002, angry because a check he was expecting did not arrive as scheduled, he barged into the program office and began rummaging through the accountant's desk. When she found him in her office ranting about his check, she informed him that it had been mailed on Friday and that he should have it in his mailbox in a day or so. Unappeased, he next went to the bank located in the same building and began screaming at employees. As a result of his abusive and outrageous behavior, Hodgkinson was barred from doing any further work for the county. Soon after this ban, he finally received his home inspector's license. The Hodgkinsons had taken custody of their grandniece, Kathy Putnam, when she was just a little girl. Her mother lost custody of her and her siblings due to abuse in the home. After 7 years, they petitioned for subsidized guardianship of Kathy, who was 12 then. It was granted. But things had spun out of control in the home, with Tom Hodgkinson seeming disgruntled over any number of things, from his family to his neighbors. In the mid-2000s, multiple issues were raised between him and his neighbors, and the police were called. He called to lodge complaints against them for petty grievances like putting their trash cans in his driveway, alleged damage to his yard, and reporting teens drinking on the property behind his home and, quote, using his driveway. But when a neighbor witnessed Hodgkinson filing a rifle from his backyard and across a field, he warned him it was dangerous as his children were playing outside. Hodgkinson launched into a rage-fueled tirade and then continued firing his weapon. The neighbor called the cops, who also asked Hodgkinson to stop firing the weapon. Still defiant, he argued with officers, saying he had a firearms license and was doing target practice, which was his right. The officers let him off with a warning and told him to be more careful. Hodgkinson's repeatedly being let off lightly for these violations may have contributed to his apparent disregard for authority. The harshest penalties he'd received for his angry outbursts, refusal to obey laws, and failure to obtain legal status for his businesses were fines or unsupervised probation. The most serious charge had been summarily dismissed. Rather than showing gratitude for his luck at not suffering any meaningful consequences, instead, he escalated his antisocial behavior. But this was soon to change when an ugly incident took place between the Hodgkinsons and their adopted daughter, Kathy. In the spring of 2006, the Hodgkinsons became the legal guardians of their grandniece, Kathy, who had been living with them for several years. 16-year-old Kathy was their grandniece. They became her legal guardians after she entered the foster care system. A neighbor befriended Kathy. Janae lived across the street with her mother, Nikki. One April afternoon, Kathy was visiting Janae. Another friend, Amy, had also stopped by. As the girls talked, Kathy began opening up about how unhappy she was living with the Hodgkinsons. She said Tom was always angry, and the couple was cruel to her. She spent so much time at her friend's house because she, quote, wanted to get away from them, she said. A short time later, Tom Hodgkinson called and told Kathy to come home. When she refused, he went across the street and forced his way into the neighbor's house. Kathy tried barricading herself into a bedroom, but her uncle barged in. In front of her friends, Hodgkinson pulled her up by her hair and threw her to the floor. As her friend's mother and Amy watched in disbelief, Hodgkinson continued to assault the teen as he pushed her out of the front door. Kathy broke away and jumped into Amy's car for safety, but Hodgkinson opened the door and tried to pull her out forcibly. She'd buckled her seatbelt, and he couldn't budge her. He took a pocket knife, cut the seatbelt, and began dragging her out of the car. By this time, Sue Hodgkinson had arrived and began yelling at her grandniece to get out of the car. She assisted her husband by dragging Kathy out of the car by her legs. She struck her grandniece and pulled her hair. Amy witnessed Tom Hodgkinson become so enraged that he grabbed his niece by the neck and started choking her. She'd been screaming at him to stop and now threatened to call the cops. He turned and struck Amy across the face with a closed fist. Afterward, he immediately returned across the street to his house. Shaken, Amy called her boyfriend and told him what had happened. He arrived, determined to confront the bully across the street. Hodgkinson greeted him at the door, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun, and pointed it at the young man. As he turned to run, Hodgkinson struck him with the stock of the gun. The man kept running and Hodgkinson fired the weapon. It is unknown whether he'd attempted to shoot the young man or fired a warning shot. Police were called and Hodgkinson and his wife were arrested. She was charged with domestic battery, and he was charged with 2 counts of battery causing bodily harm and 1 count of damage to a motor vehicle. They were both released while charges were pending. Just weeks later, police were called about Hodgkinson again. Janae's mother, Nikki, told police that he had continued to harass them and was still angry about the incident. She called the police after he deliberately ran over her dog who was sleeping in the road in front of her home. Hodgkinson claimed it was an accident. Kathy never returned to the Hodgkinsons' home. She was taken into protective custody and by July was permanently removed from their care and returned to state custody. In court, she described her life with James Thomas Hodgkinson, who she said was an alcoholic who physically abused her. She said he'd hit her in the face for failing to mow the lawn as directed, or when she argued with him. Sue Hodgkinson testified that her husband was verbally abusive to both her and Kathy, but claimed he never physically assaulted anyone. Several hearings were held in the lead-up to the trial on the domestic battery charges. Hodgkinson yelled angrily each time he was in court and became disruptive when witnesses were questioned. He was removed from the courtroom for his belligerence several times. Amy, who was called as a witness, reported that, quote, every time the judge would talk to me, Hodgkinson would have an outburst and start screaming, adding, every interaction I've had with him, I've thought, that guy's crazy. Even Hodgkinson's attorney would later describe his client as, quote, a pushy little bastard, an in-your-face kind of guy. He believed what he believed, and he wasn't going to take shit from anyone, end quote. Even so, Hodgkinson ended up skating on the assault charges when the star witness, Amy, failed to appear in court after a mix-up regarding the hearing date. All charges were dismissed. Amy said, quote, I tried to tell the court that guy's crazy and this is a big deal, but they didn't listen to me. James T. Hodgkinson had many grievances, both large and small. Between 2008 and 2012, he also began to express angry political views. In particular, he disagreed with the policies of the Republican Party. He frequently wrote letters and called his congressperson to outline his criticism. He vented his complaints in letters written to his local newspaper and in social media posts on Facebook and Twitter. A friend said that Hodgkinson was, quote, zealous about his political beliefs. He was pretty fed up with current politics, end quote. He was especially fired up about the economy and taxes. The fact that he'd shot himself in the foot financially due to his angry tirades and refusal to comply with laws concerning his business ventures added to his stress. But Hodgkinson decided that the government was the major contributor to his woes. The U.S. economy was struggling through a recession and a housing crash in 2008, when Hodgkinson began expressing more frustration with government economic policies. Between 2008 and 2012, he wrote at least 27 letters to his local newspaper, the Belleville News-Democrat, most of which advocated for increased tax brackets. He also expressed his opinion that it was Republican policies to blame for economic inequality between the wealthy and working classes. Hodgkinson supported the Occupy Wall Street movement, which sprung up in response to the Great Recession of 2008. Supporters protested against economic inequality, corporate greed, big finance, and the influence of money in politics. Protests began in New York City's Zuccotti Park, near the financial district, and lasted for 59 days, giving rise to the broader Occupy movement. Hodgkinson's letters expressed his anger and frustration at our, quote, do-nothing Congress doing nothing, while our country is going down the tubes, end quote. He was also interviewed during a protest in which he told a reporter on camera, the 99% are getting pushed around, and the 1% are just not giving a damn. By 2014, Hodgkinson was so immersed in his protests against Republican-backed policies that he began to neglect his family and friends. He was described at this time as reclusive and detached. His adopted daughter Tasha became engaged in 2014. He was uninterested and did not attend her wedding. This was in stark contrast to the importance he had placed previously on family. For example, in the early 2000s, he was commended by the Department of Children and Family Services as a dedicated foster parent in their newsletter. They ran a story about Hodgkinson who, in the hospital being treated for an illness, left his hospital bed to walk his foster daughter Julie down the aisle. He'd returned to the hospital immediately after the ceremony. Years later, when Julie was 24 years old, the article went on to say, he and his wife Sue adopted her to make her an official member of the family. But now, in the lead-up to the 2016 election, Hodgkinson was increasingly distant from his family. During family gatherings, he'd isolate himself in another room in front of his laptop, perusing political news websites. His wife began considering divorce. His mood went from bad to worse after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, when Republican candidate Donald Trump beat out Democrat Hillary Clinton in a surprising upset. Sue Hodgkinson said her husband's views took on an extreme fanatic turn after that. While others moved on with their lives, the election never ended for him, she said, stating that her husband, quote, went bananas. On November 14, 2016, 1 week after the election, James T. Hodgkinson legally purchased a Smith & Wesson 9mm semi-automatic pistol. He dissolved his business on January 17, 2017, after his home inspector's license expired. He told neighbors he was retiring and made cryptic comments to his family members that he, quote, wouldn't be around much longer. On March 22nd, Hodgkinson posted a Change.org petition on his Facebook page that called for the removal of President Trump and Vice President Pence from office for treason. His post included his comment, quote, Trump is a traitor. Trump has destroyed our democracy. It is time to destroy Trump, end quote. In March 2017, Hodgkinson purchased a conversion van and told his wife he was heading to Washington, D.C. to protest and, quote, work on tax issues. Sue thought maybe it was good for him to go, do something constructive, and get it all out of his system. She thought that maybe when he returned, they would go on road trips on his motorcycle, and he could start enjoying his retirement. She didn't know he'd sold the bike to fund his trip to D.C., and they were running out of money. After arriving in the nation's capital, Hodgkinson parked his van in Alexandria, where he lived and slept in the van for the next several weeks. He spent his days in public libraries reading newspapers and surfing the internet. He joined the YMCA to have a place to shower and exercise. After learning that Congress members were holding morning baseball practices across the street from the Y at the Eugene Simpson Stadium Park, Hodgkinson visited the ball field and took a video of the ballpark on his cell phone. He made trips to a storage locker he'd rented. Stored in his unit was a laptop computer, an SKS-style semi-automatic assault rifle, a Smith & Wesson 9mm semi-automatic pistol, and over 200 rounds of ammunition. On the morning of Tuesday, June 13th, Hodgkinson sat in the stands at Simpson Park and watched members of Congress practice for the charity game coming up in 2 days. The Congressional Baseball Game for Charity has been held since 1909. Republican and Democrat Congress members playing on opposing teams meet up annually on the ball field for a friendly yet competitive game, with all the proceeds going to various charities. After leaving the park, Hodgkinson called his wife in Illinois and told her he was out of money and wanted to come home. He missed her and their dogs, he said. He gave notice at the YMCA that he was canceling his membership. In the afternoon, he had lunch at a Chinese restaurant where he usually ordered takeout. Restaurant employees later said they were surprised when he asked for a table and ate his meal there. Afterward, he used his laptop to search for travel routes between Alexandria and his home in Illinois. He returned to the van to sleep. Tomorrow would be a big day for him. Around 5:30 a.m. on Thursday, June 14, 2017, about 25 to 30 people arrived at the Eugene Simpson Stadium Park to begin practice for the Congressional Baseball Game for Charity. Most were Congress members, others were aides or lobbyists, and all were men. There were also a handful of observers, including one congressman's 11-year-old son. At 7 a.m., James Thomas Hodgkinson drove his white van into the YMCA parking lot. Instead of parking in his usual spot by the health club, he pulled in just behind the baseball field's third base line. The baseball diamond was ringed by a chain-link fence. As Hodgkinson left his vehicle, South Carolina Congressman Jeff Duncan walked towards the parking lot. Hodgkinson approached him and asked, "Excuse me, can you tell me who's practicing? Are they Republicans or Democrats?" Duncan answered that a Republican team was on the field. "Okay, thanks," Hodgkinson responded. What you'll hear next is a detailed minute-by-minute account of the events that unfolded on January 14, 2017, written by journalist Luke Mullins in a May 2018 article for The Washingtonian. Hodgkinson returned to his van. He retrieved his assault rifle and 2 40-round magazines. He clipped onto his waistband a soft holster with a loaded pistol, and he stuffed an extra 6-round magazine into his pocket. He walked up to the chain-link fence, running parallel to the third base line. Witnesses told investigators he seemed calm and that he said nothing. He pointed the rifle towards Congressman Trent Kelly. Then he pulled the trigger. The first shot ripped across the baseball diamond at 7:06 a.m. At third base, Trent Kelly, a first-team member from Mississippi, looked to his right and saw a short, stout man on the opposite side of the chain-link fence, only 20 or so feet away. The two locked eyes. The man was pointing the long barrel of a rifle directly at Kelly, and he was smirking. He had the most nasty, sinister, just evil look on his face, Kelly says. Kind of like, I just shot and killed you, and you don't even know it yet. Kelly hollered at his teammates, "He's got a gun!" As the stadium erupted in chaos, Kelly watched time elapse frame by frame. He instantly concluded that the gunman had taken a point-blank shot at him, but missed. Kelly believed that he was still the shooter's closest target, and that the second bullet was imminent. He had to get away. Instead of running in a straight line, he zigzagged to his left and then to his right, a tactic he'd learned in the Army. He was halfway to second base when he heard shot number 2 crack past his left shoulder. Convinced the gunman was still aiming for him, he darted to his right and raced towards first base. He cut behind the pitcher's mound just as a third shot sizzled by his chest. The bullet missed him, Kelly says, but it continued whizzing in the direction of Steve Scalise, the congressional leader from Louisiana, who just 1 day earlier had been named the team's starting second baseman. I see him corkscrew, Kelly says, so I know that he's hit. Scalise collapsed onto the field and began crawling away. His legs were no use, so he pulled himself across the earth with his arms, dragging a trail of blood to the edge of the outfield grass. Then as the others bolted off the field, his arms gave out. The third most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives was stranded on a baseball diamond, helpless and alone, listening to the pounding of gunfire intensify. At that point, I couldn't do anything else, Scalise says, and I started to pray. After his opening volley, Hodgkinson began firing more rapidly. Pop, 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 pop. The players scrambled to the unlocked gate along the first base line, the field's only exit. Some flopped to their bellies by home plate. Others leapt into the first base dugout. Active shooter! Active shooter! Tyson food lobbyist Matt Mika was only a couple of strides from the exit when he felt a searing heat in his chest, like a soldering iron, he says. He noticed the blood on his shirt, staggered to a knee, but got back up and continued through the gate. On the track inside the fence in the right field corner, Zach Barth and another assistant coach lay flat on the ground trying to make themselves small. I saw him turn and swing his rifle over to us, Barth says. He listened to bullets scatter like pebbles around him until a hot pain seized his left calf. Frantic, the other assistant coach jumped up and scaled the 20-foot-high fence along the foul line. Barth dashed towards home plate and dove into a dugout, where a group of lawmakers and aides were ducking the bullets that whistled overhead. By now, Scalise was the only person left on the diamond. Texas Congressman Mike Conaway, who'd found protection behind a dugout, worried that if Scalise moved, he might attract more gunfire. "Lay still," he yelled to his friend, "lay still." From the unmarked SUV parked 20 feet from the first base gate, the two Capitol police officers on Scalise's protective detail had heard the first shot. They quickly realized that the team was under attack. Special Agents Crystal Griner and David Bailey radioed headquarters and activated a distress beacon identifying their location. Bailey moved towards the blasts. While looking around the field for the shooter, he saw players racing off the diamond and pointing to the third base line. He ran onto the field to try and assist Scalise, the man he was sworn to protect, but the bullets zipping past his head prevented him from reaching the congressman. Instead, Bailey braced himself alongside the first base dugout, steadied his Glock, and belted 10 shots across the infield at Hodgkinson, who was on the far end of the third base dugout. At that point, the House Whip was still in the gunman's line of fire, but according to the Commonwealth's attorney's report, Bailey's shots forced Hodgkinson to move. The chain-link fence prevented Hodgkinson from entering the stadium, so he walked along the outside perimeter towards the first base side of the ballpark, where the agents, lawmakers, and staff were clustered. He's walking, gun down, Sunday afternoon hunting, one witness recalls. You watch Discovery Channel? You see those guys out patrolling? He was out patrolling. He was a cool customer. From behind a shed, lobbyist Brian Kelly kept his eyes trained on Hodgkinson and hollered intel to the Capitol police officers, who didn't always have a clear view of the approaching gunman. Hodgkinson passed the bleachers and the press box before reaching the pavement behind home plate. There he pointed his rifle at the Capitol Police SUV 100 feet away. With their weapons drawn, the agents took cover on the opposite side of the vehicle as Mika lay bleeding on the ground beside them. Farther back, terrified players and coaches hid behind a shed and a large tree. Hodgkinson's rifle was much more powerful than the agents' pistols, and now he was heading right for them. At that point, I made my peace, says congressional aide Nick Ulecki. The bullets were getting closer. Outside the fence in deep right field, meanwhile, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul and Toyota lobbyist Mark Johnson lay flat on their stomachs, paralyzed by indecision. Paul had been waiting for his turn in the batting cage, and Johnson had been operating the pitching machine when the shooting began. Johnson wasn't wearing his glasses and couldn't see much without them. The echo of gunfire off the apartment building across the street made it sound as if shots were coming from two directions. Johnson worried that Hodgkinson was simply trying to flush the players towards a second gunman, or perhaps others who could pick them off more easily. Moving felt like the wrong thing to do. But as Hodgkinson appeared behind home plate and began firing up the first baseline, the risk of staying put seemed greater. According to Johnson, Paul suggested they run for it, because they had no ability to fight back. Johnson sprinted from the field, hopped a 5-foot-high fence, dashed across a dog park, and kept going. At the pavement near home plate, Hodgkinson blasted at the Capitol police officers, and they fired back. The barrage splattered bark on a large tree and popped the walls of a nearby shed, which Georgia Congressman Barry Loudermilk and a few other team members were using as protection. This guy is serious about killing us, Loudermilk thought. Texas Congressman Joe Barton's 11-year-old son Jack, who'd been tossing baseballs with the team earlier that morning, had slid underneath his car for protection. During each lull in the shootout, Jack poked his head up to see what was going on. "Jack, get down!" his father yelled from behind the dugout. Hodgkinson concealed himself behind a storage building and continued firing. A bullet ricocheted underneath the Capitol Police SUV and blazed into Matt Mika's left arm, his second wound. The 39-year-old lobbyist had played baseball at a small Midwestern college, and he joined the Republicans' team more than a decade earlier while working in the office of Michigan Congressman Tim Walberg. Now he lay motionless on his back, face ashen, blood leaking from the massive hole in his chest. As others retreated for a better cover, Loudermilk remained 10 feet from Mika behind the SUV and shouted encouragement. "Hey, Mika, it's going to be all right." "I knew Matt wasn't going to make it," Loudermilk says, "but I wanted him to know that somebody was with him when he went into eternity." As the shootout continued, Griner extended her leg outside the vehicle's cover and took a bullet. "I saw her ankle explode," Loudermilk says. Griner dropped to the ground, but according to lobbyist Brian Kelly, who had also taken cover behind the SUV, she pushed herself back up with the barrel of her pistol and returned fire once more. Later, when she could no longer stand, she shot at Hodgkinson from underneath the SUV. With Griner down, Bailey was now the only able-bodied officer between the gunman and the unarmed players. "If he goes down," Loudermilk said to himself, "that guy's coming to us." Bailey darted back and forth from behind the SUV to a position alongside the vehicle as he fired on Hodgkinson. This gave him a better sight line on the shooter, but it also left him exposed, and eventually he caught shrapnel in his ankle. Now both officers were injured, while Hodgkinson, unscathed, was still firing. Loudermilk didn't want to leave Mika's side, but decided it was too dangerous to stay. He darted for a tree farther up the first base line, his batting helmet still on his head. Alexander Jensen was in his police cruiser monitoring the morning traffic from the parking lot of the Cora Kelly Elementary School, where reports of shots fired crackled over his radio. According to the Commonwealth's attorney's report, the second-year Alexandria cop, in the final hour of an overnight shift, flipped on his sirens and raced towards the ballpark, less than 2 miles from his position. On the way, he spotted an Alexandria police car driven by Officer Nicole Battaglia, and he followed her to the scene. Jensen could hear gunfire as he approached the stadium. When he reached the entrance of the YMCA parking lot, he stepped out of the vehicle and began looking for the shooter. "He's motioning, 'Where's the gunman?'" recalls New Mexico Representative Steve Pierce, who was hiding behind a nearby car. Pierce pointed to the storage building that Hodgkinson was using as protection. When Jensen spotted the shooter, he nodded affirmatively at the congressman. Battaglia, meanwhile, was approaching the scene from a parking lot on the first base side of the diamond. Jensen heard Hodgkinson fire at Battaglia and immediately reached into his vehicle to grab his Bushmaster rifle. Because Jensen had arrived at the scene from Hodgkinson's rear, he had a line on his target. Hodgkinson was 200 feet away, but exposed. This was the clearest opportunity yet to take him down. By now, it was 7:13 a.m., 7 minutes into the gunfight. The people left in the ballpark grew desperate. Alone on the grass between second base, Scalise listened to bullets pop and continued to pray. Jack Barton had made his way into the dugout, and congressional aide Nick Ulecki had tucked the 11-year-old under a bench and behind his own body in case, God forbid, the gunman entered. Shots reverberated off the dugout's concrete walls, and blood from Bart's bullet wound dripped onto the floor. "It seemed like forever," says Senator Jeff Flake. "We're thinking, how long can this go on?" Officer Jensen loaded a round in the chamber, took aim at Hodgkinson, and fired. The shot missed the gunman. Jensen fired again. This time, he hit Hodgkinson's right hip. Hodgkinson buckled and dropped his rifle. But he wouldn't stand down. He got back up, pulled his 9mm pistol from his holster, and fired again at Bailey, as well as a third Alexandria police officer on the scene, Kevin Jobe, who had taken a position behind Bailey. Next, Hodgkinson shot at Battaglia. Jobe and Bailey realized he was distracted by a new target, so they moved in, advancing directly on Hodgkinson as they fired. Hodgkinson emerged from the protection of the cement storage building shooting his pistol as the officers yelled, "Get back! Get down!" Bailey hit Hodgkinson in the left side of his chest, spinning him counterclockwise and giving Jensen a clear shot. Jensen then fired and struck Hodgkinson in the left hip. He dropped his handgun and fell to the pavement. He was trying to get back to his feet, reaching for his gun and moaning in pain, when Jobe handcuffed him. As other officers converged, Job radioed that the suspect was in custody. "Shoot her down! Shoot her down!" It was 7:15 a.m. The moment the gunman fell, Congressman Wenstrup took off towards Scalise. Wenstrup had spent the shootout behind a cement bathroom stall outside the fence by right field, anxious to aid his injured colleague. A former Army surgeon, he understood the perils of blood loss and time. When he reached the grass behind second base, Wenstrup found Scalise lying on his right side, bleeding from a small puncture in his left hip. He tore open Scalise's baseball uniform and searched for an exit wound. "I don't see one," he remembers, "so I know he's in bigger trouble." Wenstrup concluded that the bullet had hit Scalise's hip bone and ricocheted into his midsection, where it could rupture organs and rip open blood vessels. After someone retrieved a tourniquet from the SUV, Wenstrup pushed it up as far as Scalise's leg as it would go, hoping to slow the bleeding. Scalise was grunting but conscious. At one point, he looked up at Brian Kelly, who had removed his own shirt, and used it to staunch the blood flow before Wenstrup took over. "Why is your shirt off?" Scalise asked. "Because I got muscles, Steve," Kelly replied. Just then, Alexandria firefighter and paramedic Rick Krimmer arrived with a stretcher, and first responders grabbed Scalise by his uniform and lifted him onto it. Krimmer stuck his head out of the ambulance. "Go ahead and give me a helicopter," he said. The U.S. Park Police had already dispatched its Eagle 4 chopper to the stadium. Krimmer helped load Scalise into the cabin and yelled the key details: gunshot wound to the hip, to the Park Police medic on board. Then the twin engine took off. At 8:10 a.m., Eagle 4 landed on the helipad at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, the dome of the Capitol poking above the trees in the skyline to the south. Doctors rolled Scalise into the operating room. For roughly 2 hours, they inched lower and lower into Scalise's vascular system, patching as quickly as they could, until they made another ominous discovery. Much of the bleeding, it turned out, was coming from leaking vessels located too deep in Scalise's pelvic region for them to reach safely. Had Scalise been taken to a traditional community hospital, this is the point at which he would have died. But at a level 1 trauma center like MedStar, there was still one thing left to try. Around 10:30 a.m., the surgeons placed a plastic sheet over the still open incision in Scalise's abdomen and wheeled their patient past the armed federal agents in the hallway. They were headed to a different room to see Dr. Arshad Khan. Instead of traditional surgery, Khan would use an advanced practice known as interventional radiology to try and save the congressman. Federal agents were posted outside the door, and the room had filled with nearly a dozen doctors and staff. Khan could feel the eyes on him as he eased an even smaller catheter into the damaged arteries and used tiny metal coils to try and plug the leaks. Within 16 minutes, the anesthesiologist noticed Scalise's blood pressure improving. He turned to Khan. "You got it." Scalise, at last, was stabilizing. End quote. Mass shooter James T. Hodgkinson died from gunshot wounds at George Washington University Hospital at 9:16 a.m. In a 10-minute firefight, the gunman and officers shot off over 100 rounds. In all, the gunman's bullets wounded 5 people. All survived. After the dust cleared, the shooter was the only casualty. Investigators found 3 handwritten notes on Hodgkinson when he was taken into custody. One of them listed the names of 6 Republican members of Congress and the location of their offices in the Capitol. Besides Steve Scalise, Matt Mika was the most critically injured. He'd been shot in the chest and arm, receiving wounds to his lungs, sternum, and ribs. Mika was listed in critical condition upon arrival in the emergency room. Bullets barely missed his heart. He underwent emergency surgery and was upgraded from critical to serious the next day. Mika was released from the hospital a week later to continue his recovery. Congressional aide Zach Barth and Capitol Police officers Crystal Greiner and David Bailey were treated for their injuries and made full recoveries. After months of treatment to recover from his near life-ending gunshot wounds, Majority Whip Steve Scalise resumed his congressional duties on September 28, 2017. Republicans, determined not to let one hate-filled violent individual derail their responsibilities, returned to work. Some who'd been under fire by a crazed gunman just hours earlier returned to their offices in the Rayburn building and held meetings that afternoon. it was decided that the charity baseball game would be held the following day as planned. Although the Republicans lost 11-2, the game raised more than $1 million for charity, double the previous year's amount. Congressman Mike Doyle, a Democrat from Pennsylvania who managed the opposing team, handed the game trophy to the Republican team for display in Scalise's office. That summer, President Donald Trump awarded the Medal of Valor to the U.S. Capitol and Alexandria police officers who'd risked their lives to stop the shooter and saved so many others. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. Join our Patreon to get all podcast episodes ad-free, bonus episodes, and podcast merchandise sent to you in the mail. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to find out more and join. Follow us on social media. While you're there, don't forget to like, comment, and share the podcast with others. It helps others find the show and earns you my undying gratitude. You can find all our social media links on our website, truecrimepodcast.com. Thank you so much. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia, and research is provided by Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another.